doing my PhD research on. And as part of that, I wrote a book for non-scientists on the topic. But one of the things that I looked at in that whole picture was also the transformation of brown bears to polar bears. So it's really important only in the sense that it means that for more than 25 years, I've been looking at the scientific literature on polar bears. And I haven't been to the Arctic. I'm not that kind of scientist. But what I do is bring a big picture perspective to contemporary polar bear issues. From evolutionary theory to the geological history of Arctic sea ice, fossil and archaeological record of both brown bears and polar bears, the paleoecology and zoogeography of both of those species, and also genetics. So I look at all of those different topics. And like many people, the first time I ever saw a live polar bear was in a zoo. So this first picture was taken in the Vancouver Zoo in Toronto, or in Vancouver, Canada. And I was only a few years older than you are now at the time. And I spent hours watching those bears pace around the zoo. And just the other day, I had the pleasure of visiting your polar bears at the zoo in Rotterdam. So that was special to me. So I learned most of what I know from reading the scientific papers and reports written by biologists who've been to the Arctic to study these bears. So one of the things that they've learned is that the area of polar bear habitat in the Arctic is pretty much the extent that the ice reaches in March, which is considered the end of winter in the Arctic. And there are a few exceptions. There's a few areas, 3 of them, that have sea ice, but no bears. And also no history of there ever being bears in them. And one is the Sea of Okhotsk, north of Japan. The other one is the Baltic. And the other is the Gulf of St. Lawrence in eastern North America. And I call these the armpits of the Arctic. They are the areas where there are no polar bears. Today, polar bears are well distributed throughout the Arctic. There are 19 subpopulations that are divided up this way because of different countries needing to manage their conservation. Most polar bears live on ice that's near land, so that the area in the central Arctic where there's lots of ice but there's no land, there are very few bears. They sometimes visit over the summer or use it to cross from one side of the Arctic to another. And by numbers, about half of all polar bears live in Canada. So there's a reason for Canadians being interested in bears and being invested in polar bear biology research. So polar bears travel and hunt on the sea ice. However, they don't need the ice to be especially thick. It really only needs to be about 8 centimeters thick in order to support their weight and for them to get out and hunt. And we see these kinds of conditions of fairly thin ice and bears hunting in the fall right now. And this particular photo was taken by a helicopter, from a helicopter, just last week as the ice was forming on Hudson Bay in Canada. And this is a female polar bear and her cubs that were born last spring heading out to the ice so that she can hunt for seals. Now, many polar bears spend their entire lives on the sea ice. They don't, in fact, have to come to land. They hunt, mate, and give birth out on the sea ice. Polar bears are great swimmers. They can swim hundreds of kilometers, and even cubs are good at swimming. Very young cubs are actually able to hitch a ride on top of their mother's shoulders. Now, one thing is that it's a myth that polar bears become fat to stay warm in the cold Arctic winters. In fact, polar bears need fat to survive months when there's no food, and these conditions happen both in summer and in winter. Polar bears eat about 8 months worth of the food they consume all year during the spring, between the months of April and early June. And just to show you how important this is and how much weight in fat these bears can put on, this is a pregnant female that was captured in 1984 in July, and she weighed 910 pounds or 413 kilograms. But the polar bears, the biologist who captured her, it works. You're sure?
No, you're not sure.
The polar bears are coming? Okay, all right. Can I hold it? Can I hold it?
You can take it out.
Then I can move a little bit. Okay, all right then. I will try not to talk quite so loud. But what had happened was the biologist had captured this same bear the previous November. And what they found then was she had only weighed 218 pounds or 99 kilograms. So she had put on almost 700 pounds, more than 300 kilograms in only 8 months. So this spring feeding period is immensely important because of this amount of weight in fat that these bears are able to put on. Polar bears eat cute baby seals. It's not pretty, but it's a fact of life in the Arctic. Polar bears are fattest at the beginning of July, beginning of summer, and they're leanest at the end of winter when it's still very cold. So that's how we know that, in fact, the fat is really not so important for keeping the bears warm. However, here's some pictures of nice, fat, healthy polar bears taken in summer onshore in Alaska. Even the one on the right is rivaling that pregnant female. These are healthy bears. Here's another one that was taken on the sea ice in 2015. Again, a nice healthy bear. So what ends up happening is that fasting, or going without eating for long periods, is actually entirely normal for polar bears. Most bears fast for between 2 and 5 months every summer. Many pregnant females actually fast for 8 months. So they go without food for the 4 months before they give birth in December, and then they go for another 4 months without eating while they nurse their cubs in a den in the snow before they can come out and start hunting again for seals. And most bears also fast for 2 to 3 months during the darkest and stormiest parts of the Arctic winter. So this is probably an appropriate time to talk about the starving polar bear photos that you may have seen in the news, on the internet. This particular one came from Canada, and National Geographic made a video of it and put a caption on it that said, "This is what climate change looks like." Now this video went viral to the extreme. Apparently this video was viewed more often than any other video that National Geographic produced. But it turned out they had to retract that statement and apologize because it simply wasn't true. Bears starve when they're sick or injured. Young, inexperienced bears and old, weak bears have trouble catching seals. They also have trouble defending what seals they catch from older and stronger bears. As a consequence, it means that starvation is actually the leading natural cause of death for polar bears. And so there's always going to be a starving bear around in any population just because of natural causes. And a single starving bear does not tell you anything about what the population is doing. Now, if National Geographic had had a film that showed dozens of starving bears, that would have been significant and that would have been news. But a single bear doesn't tell you anything. So let me just tell you a little bit briefly about the conservation history of the bears. The Polar Bear Specialist Group was set up in 1968 because polar bears, in fact, were very much threatened with extinction at that time. There was considered to be only between 5,000 and 15,000 bears remaining at that time because there had been so much overhunting. And in 1973, there was an international treaty made amongst all Arctic nations that have polar bears in their boundaries. And everyone agreed that they had to restrict severely hunting of polar bears. Russia was actually the first in 1956. They totally banned hunting. And several other nations followed suit. In Norway in 1972. Canada and Greenland and parts of the US still allow hunting polar bears by Aboriginal people only. But it's very much controlled and restricted. So the bear was considered vulnerable until 1996, when biologists realized that, in fact, the population had more than doubled in all of the areas where they were being studied. And so, in fact, by that time, the polar bear really had been saved from the threat of overhunting. And so they remained at this lower risk conservation level for 10 years, until 2006, when they were boosted back up again to vulnerable based on the opinion of polar bear biologists who looked at sea ice projections going out to the end of the 21st century and thought that there was a good possibility that polar bears would decline in numbers drastically and that they should be put back on the vulnerable list. And one of the things that's important here to remember is that putting the bears on the list of vulnerable based on a projection of what might happen in the future was the first time this had ever been done for any species. In 2006, both the polar bear and the common hippo were added to the red list of endangered species as both considered vulnerable. The common hippo had suffered a 95% decline in one of its most important populations, so a really visible decline in numbers sort of here and now, whereas the polar bear, its status was based on a computer projection based on what biologists thought might happen in the future. And at the time, this was confusing for many people because they were used to this particular conservation status being based on what's happening right now, and to have the polar bear listed based on something that was expected to happen in the future confused the whole picture. And in fact, it continues to be confusing for a lot of people even today. Now, a couple of years later, in 2008, the US decided to list polar bears as threatened on their endangered species list. And this time, in fact, they had their own polar bear survival model, computer model, that was used to base this new status. And I'll talk more about this in a minute. But really, it all ties into the big question, and that is, are polar bears dying because the ice is melting? So, one of the things you have to remember is that the Arctic ice is always melting and reforming. In March of every year, the ice reaches its maximum extent. In September, considered the end of the summer in the Arctic, it reaches its least extent. And so this goes back and forth every year, and the numbers change a little bit. But the thing to remember is that, in fact, in recent years, it's only the summer sea ice that has been declining dramatically.
Now that's the red line here. The black line is showing the decline in winter ice. So you see that the winter ice is indeed declining, but only by a little bit. It's the summer ice that is declining the most, and the most dramatically. And you might have heard the expression, if there's no sea ice, there'll be no bears. However, the people who say this are referring to the prediction that without summer sea ice, there might be no bears. So they often forget, they try and simplify the message, but they forget to emphasize that what they're talking about is summer ice. Research on polar bear health and population sizes since the summer ice declined in 2007 actually suggests that extinction, if summer ice declines completely, is really unlikely, which I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. But also to remember that not a single sea ice projection suggests the disappearance of sea ice in winter or spring due to human-caused global warming, even by the end of this century. So winter and spring ice is not predicted to decline. So really, for polar bears, sea ice is a seasonal requirement. They need the ice from late fall to late spring. That's absolutely true. They need it for hunting, they need it for mating, but from early summer to early fall, sea ice is actually optional. They can spend that time on land or on the sea ice that contracts into the Arctic basin. At some level, it doesn't really matter. The ice always returns in the fall. Now, these projections about the future survival of polar bears, they were based on a computer model that predicted a massive decline in polar bear numbers when the sea ice declined by almost 50%. Now, they didn't expect this decline in sea ice to happen until the middle of this century, about 2050. And in fact, it's a little difficult to see in this, but all of the bears in the purple areas off Russia on the top and left of the screen, and all of the bears in the green areas in eastern North America were predicted to disappear entirely based on this model. And the surprising thing was, though, that even though the summer ice declined far ahead of schedule, it started dropping, in fact, in 2007. The polar bear numbers simply did not plummet, as the biologists expected. And what you see here is a simple graph. The continuous black line is what the sea ice was doing. The arrow is pointing to 2005 to orient you. And what happened was the sea ice went down, polar bear numbers went up by about 16%. Not a huge amount, but they definitely did not go down. So the question then is, why were the models so wrong? For one thing, it has become clear that summer hunting for polar bears was much less important than the biologists assumed for their models. What this little captures from a BBC video of a polar bear trying to capture a seal in an area of broken ice shows is that when there's lots of open water, the seals have lots of opportunity to escape. And so the bears can try and catch a seal, but they're not very often successful. It also turns out, from looking at seals and what they do in the summer, that less summer ice is actually good for them. That what they do is do most of their feeding for the year during the ice-free season. So if the ice-free season is longer, it gives them longer time to hunt for fish and get nice and fat. Then they end up having nice, fat, healthy seal pups the following spring, and that's the food that the polar bears depend on for their food. So overall, it turns out that spring hunting was much more important for polar bear survival, but spring hunting was not included in the models because the biologists were only looking at summer ice and what was happening during the summer. And as a consequence, it also means that spring ice conditions turned out to be much more important. And what the record in the literature shows is that there has been times when ice gets too thick or there's too much snow on the ice, and that impacts either the health of the seals or the hunting abilities of the bears. So I wrote a scientific paper on this model failure. It tested the hypothesis that was proposed by the biologists, who were saying that more than 16,000 bears would disappear if summer sea ice declined abruptly by almost 50%. So this is the appropriate scientific method to address the prediction, and using evidence collected on bears and their prey since 2007. In other words, looking at the observations and applying them to the hypothesis. My argument that the prediction failed is supported by data collected and published by polar bear and seal biologists, and this paper is available and free to read online. Now, in fact, this outcome should not have been a surprise. Arctic marine mammals have been around for a long time. Ring seals, walrus, bearded seals, all animals that polar bears eat, have been around, as we know them today, for more than 2 million years. Polar bears are quite recent arrivals. They evolved from a brown bear ancestor probably between 600 and 400,000 years ago, and the studies on those vary. There's not a consensus among geneticists about exactly when this happened. However, if we look at the Ice Age history of what's happened over the last 400,000 years, when we had periods of ice ages with warm interglacials in between, and the age of the oldest polar bear fossil at about 115,000 years ago, what we see are warm interglacials interspersed with very cold ice ages. And even if speciation of polar bears happened 350,000 years ago, you can see that there were at least 2 warm interglacials that the species has been able to live through that were warmer than today, that also had no summer sea ice available to them. So how many polar bears are there left today? That's another question that people always want to know. The latest official count was about 26,000, which was made in 2015, and you can find that on the IUCN Red List assessment online. In the late 60s, so that's up from the number in the late 60s, that were probably about 10,000 bears. Additional surveys since 2015 put the total even higher at about 28,500. And there's good evidence to suggest this number may be even higher. But what do abundant polar bears really mean for Arctic residents and also visitors to the Arctic? More bears almost certainly mean more fatal attacks on people. This young Inuit hunter was killed last year in Canada in front of his 3 children because a polar bear attacked, and he happened not to have his gun with him. And he tried to protect his children, and he lost his life in the process. There's also, polar bears do damage to property, including dogs. And this is a bear that has actually come and slaughtered a whole dog team. Now, and the bear above is actually chewing the seat and all of the plastic parts on a snow machine. Now, these kinds of property are important for our Arctic residents to be able to carry on, and so the loss of these things is very devastating. So these higher numbers of bears than there were 50 years ago is now really, the bears are a danger year-round. You may have read about the invasion of 50 or so polar bears that descended on a town in coastal Russia in February of last year. This is not due to climate change or lack of ice, but simply because there are many more bears than there are now, and there are also more people across the Arctic than there were 50 years ago. Part of the difficulty is that people are no longer used to having so many bears around, and they've got complacent, and they're not taking the appropriate cautions in all cases. So that's going to have to change. So the behavior of the people needs to change in order to protect themselves from the increase in bears. So I'm really wrapping up now and give you a few points to remember. And that is that summer sea ice is not crucial for polar bear health and survival, that spring is the critical season. Less ice in summer is beneficial to ringed and bearded seals, which are the primary prey of polar bears. And even though sea ice dropped in 2007 to levels not predicted to occur until 2050, polar bear numbers did not plummet as expected. Evidence collected since 2007 shows no harm has come to polar bears or the animals they eat. In fact, all of these animals are thriving. Polar bear populations are now the highest they've been in 50 years. Officially, that number is about 26,000, but is probably much higher. And thriving polar bear populations put the safety of Arctic residents and visitors at risk. Now, even if the Arctic became ice-free in summer, it is very unlikely that it would have a devastating impact on polar bears. But lastly, only if sea ice declined significantly in early spring, such as April and May, would polar bears be at risk of extinction. So there certainly are ice conditions that would put polar bears at risk, but it would have to take place in that critical spring season. And we haven't seen that yet, nor is there a prediction that that is likely to happen. And that's the end. And did you know that a polar bear has a blue tongue? Thank you.
We hebben nog 4 minuten. Zijn er vragen voor deze mevrouw? In het Engels. Mevrouw. Ben je niet eerst durven naar mij? Nee? Okay. Can I have a question?
Okay.
I was in Canada and lots of American tourists storm at brown bears because we call it in the Netherlands the Walt Disney effect. That all animals with fur are cuddling. And I saw people step out of the car and run towards a brown bear and trying to cuddle it. We saw it. We've seen it also this summer, last summer, in a park, in a zoo park. That people get out of the car with a child on the arm.
Crazy.
Where there were lions.
Oh, yes. Yes.
To photograph the lions from
Yes.
close.
It's a very, very foolish for polar bears, and certainly with brown bears, or what are also called grizzly bears. They are so incredibly strong. I didn't show pictures of them here today, but there were some pictures from some areas of the Arctic where there was a cabin, you know, a cabin that people used seasonally, and a bear got into it by just took the door off the hinges, and then went inside and just ripped everything apart. So you wouldn't want to be there when the bear came in.
There's a question.
Yes? The polar bears have ADHD? I'd never heard that. Oh, okay, so to distract them, you mean? That you drop something to distract them? Well, one of the things that I have heard, however, is that polar bears, when they are cornered, especially by other bears and they're feeling threatened, what they do is hiss, like a cat. So they and I watched a video of a Russian photographer who was all dressed in white, and he was trying to get a really close-up photo of a bear. And so he was like here, and the bear kept coming here. And so the guy kept doing, psst, and the bear just jumped back. So that's all it takes to scare a bear away, is to hiss at it like a cat.
More questions? No more questions. Oké, dames en heren, mag ik een applaus voor... Ik wil jullie ook allemaal hartelijk danken dat je zo geduldig bent blijven zitten en zo aandachtig hebt geluisterd. Now, her English is superb, of course, so you learn a lot of that too. En bereid je maar voor, want op de universiteit zit het tweede jaar ook allemaal in Nederlands. Ja, even doen weet je dat dan. Oké. Over 2 minuten gaat de bel, dus dan zie ik jullie in een lokaal.
Ik ben Pia!